Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I hope all of you are doing well and are taking good care of yourselves and your dear ones. Today, we welcome you to the third edition of our online workshop series on scientific writing and research ethics. This edition has been specially crafted for researchers and students of medical sciences and clinical sciences. I am Banya, and I work as a communications and public engagement officer at DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, and I will be your host for today. So before we get on with the workshop, I will very briefly introduce you to the organization that I represent, DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance. India Alliance is a public charity registered in India that funds research in health and biomedical sciences. India Alliance invests in transformative ideas and supportive research ecosystems to advance discovery and innovation to improve health and well-being. It is funded by Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, and the Wellcome Trust UK. Apart from funding research, we also fund various programs that promote national and international collaborations. Again, workshops for professional skill building and capacity building in the ecosystem, and various interventions to strengthen the Indian research ecosystems. Apart from this, we are also committed to making science more accessible, and we do facilitate public engagement with science in India. You can find more information about us and our fellowships and research grants and all other events and workshops on our website. You can also follow us on social media through these handles. You can see the handles on your screen now. Yes, so India Alliance has been periodically conducting one-day science communication workshops that we call SciComm 101. We do these workshops throughout the year at different institutions around the country. The goal of these workshops is to sensitize young researchers about the importance of written and oral communication skills. And these skills, how they help you in advancing your careers and in building, and also in building public's trust and support for science. You may be doing some fantastic science, cutting-edge research, but if you're unable to communicate your work, what good it is then? So with that motive, we conduct these workshops, and it is important to understand that these professional skills that you learn during your academic life will really come in handy in any career that you choose to pursue at a later stage in your professional life. With that introduction also, I would like to add something here, that it is important to remember that attending one workshop is not going to make any one of us an expert in science communication. But what is important here is that you put your learning into practice. Under the current circumstances, the standard avenues for conducting in-person workshops are unavailable due to the restrictions in place due to the pandemic. However, virtual events have been a viable alternative for India Alliance, and we have been conducting these online workshops for the research community of India. We really hope that you find today's workshop useful and you'll participate actively and engage with our trainers today. So moving forward, I would just very quickly introduce you to my colleagues who have made this workshop possible. Sara Iqbal, Hina Latif Nizami, and Yukti from India Alliance, Neha Vyas from EditEdge. EditEdge is our knowledge partner for this workshop. We all have worked together to organize and facilitate this workshop for you. Before we dive into the workshop, bear with me for just 2 more minutes because these are some very important housekeeping announcements. The webinar is going to be recorded. So if any of your friends miss out on today's session, they can always follow the webinar through the recording. We will post this recording on the YouTube channel of India Alliance. If you have a question, you can type them in the chat box, but please start your question with the word question. If you have a comment, please start it with the word comment in caps. This will help our moderators to sort through the questions and attend to most of your questions and not miss out on any. In case the webinar abruptly ends, do not panic. You will be able to join back the webinar again by using the same registration link. Please know that we will be issuing e-certificates to only those who will attend the entire workshop and submit the post workshop survey form also. So keep an eye out for the survey form after the workshop ends. You will receive the certificate within 5 to 7 working days. And if you plan on sharing any highlights from today's workshops, please do tag our social media handles and share them as you like. Quickly, here is the agenda. This is how the workshop looks today. Introduction is already done, so we will go to session 1, which is basics of scientific writing and structuring your manuscript. Then it will be followed by a very short question and answer session, and then we have a 5-minute screen break. Session 2 is on ethics in research and communication, and then we have a general question and answer session, and we will end the workshop with a special segment on careers and networking skills in medical and clinical research. Yeah, so I will move on to the first session, which is basics of scientific writing and structuring your manuscript. This will be delivered today by our expert Malti Ganeshan from Editage. The second session on ethics in research communication, research and communication will be delivered by Dr. Sunaina Singh, again from Editage. On that note, I would like to invite Malti, Assistant Managing Editor in Life Sciences and Academic Trainer with Editage from the past 5 years. Malti is proud to have the privilege of helping researchers communicate their work to the larger community. And she believes that effective communication is the backbone of collaborative science in the 21st century. I'm with you on that, Malti. So over to you with that.
Hi, Banya. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope that everyone's doing well. So I'll just get right into it. So I will be sharing my screen. So I will not be looking constantly at the chat. So please bear with me if I need to occasionally intermittently go and have a look at the chat, and then I'll get back to any questions at that time. So I won't constantly be monitoring, but I'll look periodically. So I can address either any questions as they come up if they're pertinent at the time, or we can address them at the end of the presentation. We may have the question answer session. All right. Right. So as we said, we'll start by talking about scientific writing and manuscript structure and why these things are important. Now, why these things are important is, I think, something important to get out of the way right at the beginning. So this is because in an ideal world, journals would only reject manuscripts based on the quality of the science that those manuscripts are reporting. But in practice, things don't actually always work like that. So why do journals reject manuscripts? One reason could be deficiencies in the study. In terms of poor study design, statistical analysis, insufficient data, all these things. The other reasons are not really to do with the quality of the study or the quality of the science itself. It's to do with poor presentation in terms of either the writing of the manuscript itself, with regard to either language or the overall presentation of the work, or a lack of understanding of the journal requirements and the target readership. Now, following manuscript preparation guidelines is, I think, a separate issue, which I'll get into a little bit towards the end of my session. But it's also important to ensure that you pick the right journal for what the study that you want to report. It's important that you ensure that you're presenting your study to the right audience. So this is why this becomes important. So largely today we'll be talking about poor presentation and a lack of understanding of journal requirements and target readership. So let's just get right into it. Right, so scientific writing. If you ask me, the tenets of scientific writing are quite simple. Keep it brief, keep it simple, be precise, and don't let your language distract the reader from your message. Now, you don't want the reader to be thinking about the way that you're presenting your message, because the message that you're presenting itself is quite complex. So you want to keep your presentation and your delivery very simple and very easy to follow, so that the reader can focus on the complexity of what you're presenting. Right, so that said, in terms of language, there are some things that can distract the reader very much from the message that you're presenting, and that is, of course, any errors in your writing. So we'll talk about some. There are, of course, many, many more than this, but we'll talk about some of the major errors that can happen in scientific writing and how to avoid them. And today I'll be talking about punctuation errors, grammatical errors, errors related to sentence structure, and wordiness. Okay. So from punctuation errors, again, there are many types. I'm going to talk about one in particular, which is called the comma splice, which is when you have two complete sentences which are joined by a comma. Now, why is this incorrect? This is incorrect because if you have two complete sentences, you can join them with a conjunction and then a comma, but not with a comma alone. So, for example, Alzheimer's disease is currently the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, comma, it's the only disease in the top 10 for which there are no disease-modifying medications. Now here, if I had an and after the comma, this sentence would be fine. But as it is, the presence of this comma makes this sentence grammatically incorrect. Now, how do you fix a sentence like this? There are, again, like I said, many ways. One that I suggested is just to add the word and after the comma, and then it's a grammatically correct sentence. There are some alternatives. One, you can replace the comma with a semicolon. Now, semicolon is a slightly more emphatic separator of sentences. So it's acceptable for a semicolon here to separate the two sentences without the need to add another comma, another conjunction to separate them out again. The other way that you can fix this is, of course, to just change it into two different sentences. So add a period and then begin the next sentence with a capital letter. And then again, you have two grammatically correct sentences. So like I said, there are many, many ways to fix these errors. The challenge that I've always felt is to identify the error and to know why it's an error. So I'm hoping that this will help you do that. Okay. The next type of error we'll talk about is grammatical errors, and specifically we'll talk about subject-verb agreement errors. Now, this I find comes up a lot in scientific writing because we're working with very long sentences. So it's not always easy to identify that something is an error. For example, baroreflex sensitivity, defined as reflex changes in heart period in response to changes in blood pressure, are the most frequently used characteristics of the baroreflex. Now, this is obviously grammatically incorrect because I have highlighted the sort of the relevant words for you, so you can see that it's not what the sentence is supposed to be. But why does this happen? Now, this is because why has the author incorrectly used plural verbs in the second half of the sentence? This is because he is responding to the presence of these plural changes. But the thing is, the sentence, the words in the second half of the sentence need to agree not with these changes, but with the actual subject of the sentence, which is sensitivity. So the correct way to phrase this sentence would be baroreflex sensitivity is the most frequently used characteristic. Okay. So move on to errors related to sentence structure. Now, these are not as obvious or as clear-cut as a grammatical error, but they do affect the way that the reader is able to understand what you're saying. So, for example, currently another broad term has become popular as an alternative to final SIDS decision, that is sudden unexpected death in infancy in an apparently healthy infant presenting at 7 to 365 days of age. Now here, the broad term that the authors are talking about is SUDI or SUID. But what has happened here is because you're placing it as an alternative to a final SIDS decision, the reader is left wondering whether the SUDI is an alternative or a broad term. But here, actually, what we know that the author means that it is a broad term. So if you move this phrase, then it suddenly becomes clear. The reader doesn't need to stop to think about what exactly it is that you're saying. He can absorb your message and he can move on. Okay. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about lack of parallel structure. Now, what is parallel structure? Parallel structure basically means that if you have a sentence that is in the form of a list, then each item in that list needs to be in the same format. So here's an example of what I mean. In hospitality, mortality rates were 23% for community acquired, 90% for health associated, and hospital acquired infections accounted for 33%. Now, as a scientist or as a clinician, you know what the author is saying here. You're saying there's 3 different categories of infections, and these are the percentages of each. But as a reader, when you read this sentence, you might need to read it a couple of times because your brain is expecting that because you're saying blah, blah, blah for community acquired, blah, blah, blah for healthcare associated, you would also expect to see blah, blah, blah for hospital acquired infections. And when the sentence is kept in this format, then it becomes easy for you to read. Again, you can quickly absorb the message and you can move on. So these are some of the reasons why your writing might cause the reader to find your manuscript difficult to absorb. And these are quite small things. The reader might not even be consciously aware that these are the reasons why the manuscript is difficult for them to read. But if you can identify these at the writing stage and if you can correct them yourself, then they become a non-issue for your reader. Okay. So we'll move on. To the next one, to wordiness. Now, wordiness is, again, it's not an error, but it is something that I see a lot in scientific writing because a lot of people, I mean, I don't just mean non-native speakers, even native speakers of English have this impression that a scientific manuscript or any scientific writing needs to be very wordy and very full of, big words and long sentences. Otherwise, people will not take it seriously. Now, obviously, you don't want your writing to be informal, but nor do you want your writing to be so wordy that your message is getting diluted by the number of words that you're using. Now, in order to reduce this wordiness, one way that you can do that is to change the voice. Now, what is voice? Voice is what is called passive versus active voice. So, for example, I kicked the ball is active voice, whereas the ball was kicked by me is passive voice. Now, even with this sentence that I've given you, you can see that the passive voice sentence is much longer. Now, passive voice tends to be used a lot in scientific writing because when you're describing an experiment or describing a result, the person who is doing the experiment is not really the important factor. What is important is what is being done. So the passive voice emphasizes the action rather than the actor, which is why a lot of people like it for scientific writing. But it can make sentences quite complicated. For example, the number of flushes performed for each catheter could not be determined, nor could it be assessed whether the nurses who inserted the catheter had received appropriate training. Now, this is not an excessively long sentence. I just chose it because it was a good example of how using passive voice can make the sentence very convoluted. Now, if we decide to use active voice, now obviously the people who could not determine the number of flushes or assess whether the nurses had training, this is obviously the people who were conducting the study. They've chosen to use passive voice to emphasize what they found or did not find. But if you change the sentence to active voice, say, we could not identify the number of flushes performed or assess whether the nurses had training. So not only do you reduce the number of words in the sentence, you also make the sentence a lot more straightforward. So these are some ways in which your writing itself can make your message easier to absorb for your reader. The other main thing, which is the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today, is how you can use manuscript structure to fulfill that same role. That is to make your message easier for your reader to absorb. Why is manuscript structure important? One is that it imposes a logical sequence on the flow of ideas. This is obviously important if, like I said, your message itself is quite complex. You don't want the complexity of your delivery to distract from the complexity of your message. It ensures that the message you want to convey is the same one that the reader receives. Now, especially if you're trying to communicate scientific findings, you want to eliminate as far as possible the possibility of misinterpretation. So that's why this becomes important. Then, like I said, like I've been saying from the beginning, presenting complex science in a simple form. And the last reason is that it conforms to reader expectations. Now, when somebody reads a manuscript, he expects it to be in this format. If something is different, he is going to expend cognitive energy trying to understand why you've chosen to do it differently, rather than spending that energy understanding the work that you're presenting or the findings that you're telling him about. Okay. So what is the purpose of a manuscript? Answering this question actually will help you to structure your manuscript itself, which is why I've put it here. So what is the purpose of manuscript? Is to answer what is called the 4 W's, which are: why is the study important? What methods were used to conduct the study? What were the study findings? And what is the significance of those findings? Now, if you go by these 4 questions, there is a very popular and very simple manuscript structure format that emerges, which is called the IMRaD format. Now, the IMRaD format basically is answering these 4 W's, which is why did we do it, which is the introduction, what did we do, which is the methods, what did we find, which is the results, and what do those results mean, which is the discussion. So that is IMRAD, IMRaD. Okay. So what makes a manuscript? Now, the components of a manuscript are, as mentioned in the IMRaD format itself, your title, your abstract, keywords, introduction, methods, results, and discussion. So we'll go through these sections one by one and talk about their functions, what can go wrong with them, and how you can fix those. Okay, so first of all, the title. It summarizes the study in under a sentence. Now, we'll talk about why the length of the title is interesting a little later. But it also makes the study interesting to its target audience. Now, I mentioned this because it's important to ensure that your title reflects the audience that you're presenting your study to. So, for example, if I were presenting, say, the mode of action of a new drug, if I were presenting it to pharmacists versus if I were presenting it to clinicians, the message that I'm delivering is different in each case. So my title should reflect that. If I'm presenting it to somebody who's primarily interested in pharmacology, he's going to be more interested in the mode of action. Whereas if I'm presenting it to a clinician, he's going to be more interested in the actual action or effectiveness of that drug. So even if I'm presenting the same work to both of these groups of people, my title should reflect which group I'm presenting it to. And it makes the study accessible to its target audience. Now, what does this mean? Now, the way that most people find articles or find research to read about is by using internet searches and the internet searches are based on keywords. Now, if your title does not contain the keywords that most people would use to find studies of that type, then it's less likely that they will encounter your study. So the places where internet searches employ keywords to help readers find studies is the title, the abstract, and the actual keywords list. Now, you want to maximize the number of keywords that will allow people to find your study. So ideally, you want your title to have all the important keywords, and you want your keywords list to supplement but not duplicate those same keywords. So in fact, many journals will tell you, if you're going to give us keywords, do not give us the same words that are there in the title. So this is what makes it easier, what makes the study what is called more discoverable. Okay. So some ways in which you can improve a title. Randomized clinical trial analyzing maintenance of peripheral venous catheters in an internal medicine unit, heparin versus saline. Now, this is actually a title that was published in this form. Now, there are some important elements of this title that need to be present regardless of how you're going to actually frame the title itself. These are the randomized clinical trial, the type of study that it is, maintenance of peripheral venous catheters, which is what the study is actually examining, in internal medicine unit, which is where the study is taking place, or the study population, and heparin versus saline, which is the 2 types of venous catheters that the study is looking at. Now that I have boxed all the important elements, you see that I have not boxed the word analyzing. Now, why is that? Because if you're putting this information in the title, it is obvious to the reader that you're analyzing all of them. So the word analyzing, usually things like analyzing, study of, evaluation of, these words and phrases are usually not necessary in a title. So I would actually eliminate this word from the title altogether. One other change that I would make is I want to emphasize the novel findings of the study. Now, I do that by ensuring that they come up in the title as early as possible, which means that I don't necessarily want the randomized clinical trial to be the first thing that the reader reads when they read my title. So I would want to move that to the end of the title, which means that the title looks something more like this. Maintenance of peripheral venous catheters in an internal unit, heparin versus saline, a randomized clinical trial. Now you still have all of the same elements, right, in the title, except that randomized clinical trial has now moved to the end because it's only the type of study that was conducted. One other change I would make is, because I want to emphasize that you're comparing heparin and saline peripheral venous catheters, I would want to move that phrase to a little earlier in the title. So the final version of the title that we have come up with looks like this: maintenance of heparin versus saline peripheral venous catheters in an internal medicine unit, a randomized clinical trial. all of the elements of the study are still there. They are just now in a form where the reader immediately knows what you're doing and what it is about the study that's important. Okay, so what can go wrong with the title? It can be too long. This can happen when you have a lot of information that you need to add in the title and you want to put in all of it. Many times it's possible to eliminate a lot of things in the title. So for example, in this particular title, do I really need to have the words in an experimental model? Probably not. But if I'm submitting to a journal where the distinction between is this an experimental model versus is this in clinical practice is important, then I need to have that. So you need to weigh the length of the title versus what information is actually important. If all this information is important, obviously nothing can be eliminated. But as far as possible, you need to pare down your title to the bare minimum. So what else can go wrong? Not leading with what is important. We saw a little bit of this already in the previous example with the randomized clinical trial, that phrase coming right at the beginning. So you don't want the non-important phrase to be what begins the title. So here again, I would not put a multi-center study as the first thing in the title. I would say prevalence and risk factors of malaria and anemia, blah, 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 a multi-center study. Or if the fact that it's a multi-center study is less interesting than the study results themselves, I might not even add that phrase to the title. One final thing that can go wrong with a title is using what is called as clickbait to mislead the reader. Now, I added this particular example specifically because in these times, any publication to do with COVID-19 is obviously going to be emphasized. People are going to be actively searching for these publications. Journals are actively seeking to publish such papers. So what is happening is, unfortunately, a lot of authors, in an effort to make their manuscripts more attractive to journal editors and to get them to publish those papers, are either adding COVID-19 to their titles, where it might not necessarily be directly about COVID-19, or they might be doing things like this: competing with the pandemic, trends in research design in a time of COVID-19. Now, this particular study was simply about the fact that the number of studies related to COVID-19 has increased and the number of non-COVID-19 related studies has decreased. Now, that's a very simple result for such a grandiose title. And especially in these times when interested readers are actively going to be searching for publications related to COVID-19, it's important not to mislead your readers, to ensure that they don't spend time reading studies that are not actually relevant to them because they've been misled by your title or your keywords. Just wanted to add that there because it is something that we are seeing lately more and more. Okay, I just wanted to add this because people talk a lot about so-called catchy titles. This should be used wisely. Like I said, you don't want the title to be so long that the reader loses interest in what you're saying halfway through the title. So what a catchy title does is it makes the title more interesting to read, so the reader is probably going to stop. Now, I do anything for research, but I won't do that. It's actually a joke related to a song called I Would Do Anything for Love, but I won't do that. So if you know the song and you read this title, it makes you laugh, and then you carry on reading the rest of the title. It's not actually entirely related to the study because they're just talking about the kinds of studies that older adults tend to be interested in. So it's not directly relevant, but it does stop the reader and make them laugh and make them interested. So I would say it's a good title. Okay, we move on to the abstract. Obviously, the abstract provides an overview of the study, and it does so using the following conceptual subsections: your background, which is why the study was conducted, your aim, your methodological approach, your principal findings, and your significance or conclusion. Now, the abstract should contain a few important elements, which is the independent variable, which is what you manipulate, the thing that you keep constant, or the thing that you are able to manipulate as the researcher to obtain the results you're looking for. The dependent variable, which is the thing that you're actually measuring, your study population, your condition of your subjects during the study, and your experimental approach. So these are things that are important for the reader to understand the methodology of what you've done. Okay, so let's take a look at the abstract. Now, this particular abstract has actually been explicitly structured into the sections that I was talking about. So now, if you hark back to the 4 W's that you were talking about earlier, your background of the study is what tells you why was it done. Then you have your methods, which tells you what methods were used. Then you have your results, which tells you what was found. And you have your conclusion, which tells you what it means. The abstract might not always be structured into these subheadings, but even if they're not structured, you should still be able to visually identify where these 4 boxes are in your abstract. What can go wrong? Obviously, missing information. The most common example of missing information that I usually see in abstracts is missing background. So the authors want to get right to the point and say, okay, we want to tell you what it is that we found. So they'll immediately start talking about the methods and results of their study. So the abstract will literally begin, in this study and then they will go on with the aim of the study, which is fine. But the abstract is very often the only part of a manuscript that a reader will see. Say, for example, especially for those of us living in India and not having access to a lot of journals that require paid subscriptions to access full text articles, unless you have access to an institutional library that subscribes to those journals, it can be difficult. So very often, the only part of the study that you immediately have access to via the internet is the abstract. So for us, deciding whether we want to ask for paid access to a study will depend on whether we find the abstract useful to us or not. So if you have information missing in the abstract, then you're giving the reader less of a chance to determine whether they want to read the full paper of the study or not, whether the full paper of the study will be relevant to them. So it's important to add all this information to the abstract so that it's a more effective encapsulation of your study as a whole. So your background, your methods, and your significance should all be well represented in the abstract. The results is usually the one part of the study that is always represented, because that's the part that the authors find the most interesting, what they found. So that generally tends to be present, but these other elements are also important. What else can go wrong? Overemphasis on the methods or the results at the expense of other information. This is a similar problem to the first one. What can happen sometimes is that there will be 1 line of background, there will be 7 lines of methods, 1 line of results, and then the abstract ends. Now, obviously, unless the methodology is what was interesting about the study, this is probably not an effective representation of what the study was actually about. So you want to ensure that whatever was important in your study is represented appropriately in the abstract. In the same vein, you need to ensure that the main findings of your study are emphasized. You don't want the reader to wonder what was the principal result of your study. It should be very clear from the abstract. And the last thing is, you should not add information to the abstract if it is not also being represented in the main text. So for example, say if you found a result in your abstract and you feel that it is peripherally relevant to some other disease other than the one that you're studying, you might briefly mention it in the abstract, oh, this could also be relevant to Parkinson's disease. But your main text, the reader finds that you don't actually focus on Parkinson's at all. So then the abstract is not an effective representation of your study. If you want to mention Parkinson's in the abstract, it should definitely also be represented in the main text in some way. Okay, let's move on to the introduction. The introduction is a very important and honestly very misused part of the manuscript. What it needs to do is introduce the reader to the research problem with appropriate context, explain what is known, which is important for the reader to understand what background you're coming to the study from. It should state the knowledge gap in the field, that is what is not known, and how the study aims to fill that knowledge gap. It should definitely explain why the study is novel, if it is novel. Unfortunately, in these times, most journals tend not to prioritize the publication of findings that are not novel. That's a whole other problem. But if your findings are novel, that's something definitely that you should be emphasizing. It should end with an explicit aim statement. The reader should not reach the end of the introduction and wonder what is the research question that the authors are trying to answer. That research question should be in your face in a sentence. Ideally, that sentence should say the aim of the present study was, or in the present study we aim to. There should be no ambiguity about it. And optionally, you can have a brief overview of the methodological approach. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that you list your entire methods at the end of the introduction. You can briefly say, the aim of the present study was blah, 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 blah. We used, a case series, or we examined patients enrolled in a hospital for so-and-so over so-and-so period and examined these findings. Couple of sentences, nothing more. Okay. Another most interesting part of the introduction, the thing that best helps you to structure your introduction effectively, is what is called the funnel structure. What is a funnel structure? Basically, your funnel structure should take your reader from the very general background that you're presenting to help them understand why your study was important, to get more and more specific as you get to what is the status quo of the work that you're doing, what is the problem, what is the knowledge gap, and how you're trying to fill it, and end with a very explicit and very specific aim statement. Your aim statement cannot be relevant to any study other than your own. Unless your study is not novel and you're duplicating somebody else's findings, or you want to redo somebody else's study to ensure that the findings are also applicable in your patient cohort, whatever. But the aim statement should be very, very specific, and it should lead from a less specific background, and it should narrow the focus of your reader so that by the time they get to the aim statement, they're only thinking about your aim. So let's look at an example of this. I actually liked this study because this, what little bit of text that I'm presenting on the screen here is the entire introduction of the study. So this is maybe what, 6 sentences, 7 sentences. But if you, as you'll see, all of the information is very, very clearly presented here. So here's your background. Now this is what has been done. This is what is known. Here's your status quo. This is what we do know about the study under question. Here is the problem statement, that is what is not known here. However, its usefulness in PVCs remains controversial. So when the reader reads this, they expect that the aim statement is going to be directly related to this sentence. And as you get to the last sentence of the introduction, you see that that is exactly what the authors have done. So I thought this was great. This is really short, really effective, and it tells you exactly what you need to know. And it also brings up another point that's really important about the introduction. Your introduction is not the right place for you to add an extensive literature review. You're not trying to review the literature. You are trying to give the reader only so much information that they need to understand why you conducted your study in particular. I think this is a good time to, actually no, we'll move on to what can go wrong. Basically, what can go wrong is not having all the elements that we talked about earlier. So your gap in knowledge or your novelty is unclear, or your study aim is unclear. You might have too much methodological information in the last paragraph, especially if you're following the IMRaD format, where the method comes immediately after the introduction. If you have a full description of the methods at the end of the introduction, and then you have an entire section talking about the methods again, that feels repetitive to the readers. That's not a good idea. You also don't want to sum up the whole study in the last paragraph, because you want the reader to feel an incentive to go on to read the rest of the manuscript. Now, at the end of the introduction, if you tell him the methods, you tell him the results, and you tell him the significance, he's going to be less invested in reading the rest of the text. And talking about literature studies, you don't want an extensive literature review in the introduction. Say, for example, especially if it's a case report, if you're reporting, one specific patient or a few specific patients, a very specific case, you only want to give so much information that the reader will need to understand why you're reporting this case in particular. So, for example, if you're reporting a specific adverse event in response to some medication in a patient, your introduction does not need to go into detail about the mortality of the study itself, because while it is obviously related, it's not directly relevant to the adverse event that you're reporting. Too much background that is too general. So again, for example, if you're submitting a manuscript to a cancer journal, you don't need to have a paragraph at the beginning of the introduction explaining why cancer research is important. Every person who reads that journal is already going to know that. So that needs to be tailored to your audience to a certain extent. But on the whole, you want to avoid being very general in your introduction, because you can assume a certain degree of scientific literacy in your audience. Then you can have your funnel structure not being followed. Now, the funnel structure, the advantage of that is that it makes the introduction very focused. So if you don't follow that structure, then you lose that focus. And the last thing is you can have abrupt transitions between paragraphs. Now, I understand why authors do this, because they say, okay, in my introduction, for the reader to understand the study, they need to know A, B, C, D, E. Now, his temptation is just going to be to put A, B, C, D, E in the order that he thinks they're important. But if he doesn't transition from one paragraph to the other effectively, it's not a list that he's writing, right? He's trying to craft a narrative. He's trying to create what scientists call a story. Now, if you're creating a story, you need to have transitions. So if your paragraphs are going to be completely unrelated to each other, then the reader is not going to understand how all of these elements come together to lead you to the aim of your study. So you need to ensure that the paragraphs lead from one to the other effectively. Okay. Before we move on to the methods, I'm just going to quickly check in with the chat. Okay, so for a systematic review or a meta-analysis, you don't again want to be very detailed in terms of the introduction. You only need to provide only that information that tells the reader why the systematic review is necessary. So you're not trying to, so your systematic review itself is going to be a review of the literature, right? So you don't need to again review the entire literature in the introduction. What you need to explain is why this is necessary, why if there's any ambiguity in the status quo, or if there are things that we don't know, how is that systematic review going to address this? I think a couple of people have asked questions about length, manuscript length. It doesn't, unless the journal has a limit on length, you generally don't need to think about it, but you definitely don't want the introduction to be so long that it stops the reader from being interested in the rest of the paper. Okay, I'll come to the other questions a little bit later because they're not specific to the introduction. They're a little more focused on manuscript writing in general. So I'll come back to those. Okay. So we'll get into the methods a little bit. I think somebody had a question about the methods. 2 or more papers using the same data set. Okay, I'll get to that. Okay, so the function of the method section is to 1, state the study design, provide a comprehensive description of the methodology, provide a statement of ethics approval, which is, if you're working with human subjects, extremely important, presented in logical order, and describe in detail the statistical analysis used on the data. Unless it's a case report, statistical analysis is never not going to be relevant. So here's a brief method section to show you where these elements would come. So here are your subjects. Here's your ethics statement. Here's your inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study. Here are the procedures and protocols that were used. And here's your statistical analysis. Okay, now, before I talk about what can go wrong, I think somebody had a question on 2 or more papers using the same data set. If you're writing 2 or more papers using the same data set, both those papers should make that extremely clear. Sunena is going to talk about this in a little more detail, so I won't get into it too much. But basically, the reader needs to be very clear that there was a definite need for having 2 different papers in the same data set. So, for example, if the data set for both the papers is exactly the same, what you can do is that when you're writing the second paper, you can refer to the first paper and say, so-and-so data set as reported in, and then give the citation of the first paper as a reference. You do want to briefly explain so that the reader is not completely dependent on going and referring to your first paper, but you can refer to the first paper when you're writing the second. I hope that answers the question. Okay. So what can go wrong with the method section? You can have subheadings that are not in logical order. You can have missing information. So ethics approval, inclusion criteria, citations for previously used methods. We talked about this a little bit right now, and statistical analysis. And you don't want to have unnecessary detail provided for cited methods. So this again harks back to the same question, which is that you don't want to, if you're already referring the reader to a previous paper, you don't want to completely repeat yourself. So in terms of structured versus unstructured methods, it depends on the methods themselves. Let me put it this way: you're never going to be at a disadvantage if you use subheadings to structure your methods. But it might not always be necessary if your methods are relatively simple. Say, for example, if it's a case series that you're reporting and you're saying, we enrolled 50 patients between the years A and B. We did so-and-so biochemical tests, so-and-so imaging analysis, and the statistical methods that we used were whatever, we ran t-test or we ran ANOVA. That's relatively simple. It's probably going to be only 6 or 7 sentences. In that case, you might not need a structured methods. But for example, in the previous method section that we looked at, The authors here chose to add a separate subsection for image analysis because it was a sort of relatively self-contained part of the methods. So they chose to add only one subsection, and the rest of it, they said it's fine if we have it all together. So it depends on the complexity of the methods that you're using. So some set questions are not directly related to methods. I'll come back to those later. Okay, so let's move on to the results. So obviously the function of the results is to present the new information that the authors have gathered using the methods described previously. And you want to prioritize results over data. Now, what does that mean? What is a result versus what is data? Okay, so result is the thing that you determine. The data is what leads you to make the determination. So for example, if you have, let's say, you have one of your outcomes in your study was say fractures. So if you say 17 patients out of the 24 had fractures in the 6 months following the intervention. Now that is data, 17 of 24. But your result will be X percentage of patients had fractures. That's a result. Okay, so you can present your results in many ways. And I just want to talk a little bit about this because this is the biggest decision that you'll make when you're writing the result section. When to use text, when to use tables, and when to use figures. Use text when your data are not extensive or complicated, or when the data are peripheral or not related to the main findings. You use a table to show numerous values or other data in a small space, usually numerical. You use it to compare values of statistics or to show the presence or absence of specific characteristics. And you use figures to show trends, patterns, and relationships, where the general pattern is more important than the more specific data points, and to illustrate a sequence of events. So for example, here's your result, basic characteristics of the ICUs, and this is the actual data that is responsible for coming to that result. So similarly for the table, an increase in mean daily temperature accompanies an increase in the occurrence of PBSI. That's the result. And this is the data that leads the reader to that result. Okay. So I think a lot of people are asking about reviews. I'll get to that at the end because it doesn't really fit in the IMRaD format. Okay. So what can go wrong? Repetition of the methods, repetition of material presented in figures and tables, inclusion of detailed information more suited to a figure or table, or inclusion of interpretive material better suited to the discussion. Now, when I went back to the chat, I saw one question that is relevant at this point, so I'll just get to it here. If during the course of your study, you encounter a finding that is not related to the hypothesis with which you started out the study, you can report this in the results. You can go into it in detail in the discussion, and you can explain maybe why you didn't expect it, why it was surprising. It's a bad idea to retrospectively go back and change your study hypothesis, because your study hypothesis is what caused you to design your study in a specific way. So if you find something incidental or unrelated to your initial hypothesis, you can't then go back and add it as another hypothesis because it was not part of your study design. But you can definitely mention it in the results, and you can go into it in detail in the discussion. Okay, so moving on to the discussion. You want to what is called invert the cone. So the funnel structure that we talked about in the introduction, we're going to flip that basically. So what does the discussion do? Provides an interpretation of the results, any relationships identified. It gives context to the findings, whether they and in the light of previously reported work, whether that work is in support or in contradiction of your current findings. It explains any implications of the theoretical, practical, policy, any recommendations that you want to make for future work. It explains the limitations of the study and the context in which the findings should be interpreted or applied, especially for if you're reporting, say, almost any clinical information. In fact, you want to be very clear on the context in which those findings should be interpreted. And you want to end with a take-home message which gives the reader the significance of the findings. Okay. So in the discussion and in conclusion, you want to interpret, give context, explain limitations, explain implications, and end with a take-home message. And this is what is called inverting the cone, because you go from something that's very specific, which is the results of your study, and then you go from that to a more general explanation of the implications, and the take-home message, which should be more broadly applicable. Okay. What can go wrong? You don't want to again re-summarize your findings in the first paragraph, because you've already just spent an entire section which is called the results doing exactly that. You don't want to repeat or present material that's better suited to the introduction. Either it should be in the introduction, or if it's purely introductory and you've already gone into it in the introduction, you can just remove it. You need to ensure that you add limitations and a take-home message. And importantly, you should not introduce completely new material in the discussion. Now, what does that mean? Your discussion should be confined to your study aim and your study results. You shouldn't suddenly come up with something completely new in the discussion. You shouldn't introduce new findings which are not discussed in the results section. If you're introducing, say, a new, not a new hypothesis, but if your results led you to draw some conclusion that is not related to your initial hypothesis, if you want to discuss that in the discussion, you need to first report it in the results. So you can't introduce completely new material in the discussion unless it's very small and very incidental. Okay, and finally, the conclusion. Obviously, if you don't have a concluding statement or take-home message in the conclusion, that's a failure of the conclusion. You need to ensure that you discuss the implications and the scope of future work. And your conclusion is not the abstract. So your conclusion should not only just re-summarize the study. The abstract is already doing that for the reader. So you need to present new, meaningful information, which the reader would not have the context for without having gone through your results and discussion, which basically means what are the implications of your findings and what is their significance. Okay. Now just briefly talking about combining results and discussion. The good thing about doing this is that you have the result and the interpretation side by side. So the reader can view the result and understand what its context is immediately, and that reduces the repetition of presenting the result in the result section, then coming to the discussion, talking about the result again, and then interpreting it. So if you have a combined section, you can do both of those at the same time. So that's a definite advantage. The disadvantage is that you might have to compromise on the linearity of reporting of the results. So if you want to talk about, say, you want to talk about patient characteristics, blood work, imaging, and then any sort of clinical stuff, if you use a combined results and discussion, sometimes you lose out on that linearity. So you need to weigh it versus, what is important to you. Are the results very complicated and you want the reader to be able to interpret them right away? Or do you feel that, the structure of the results is more important? So depending on that, you might want to choose. And sometimes journals will say, we don't want a combined results and discussion, or we want a combined results and discussion, in which case, of course, the decision is out of your hands. Okay, so before I get into checklists, I'll talk quickly about review articles. So now review article does not have a very standard or prescribed structure the way that research articles do. But normally you would have an introduction, which again should follow the same rules as the introduction for a research article, which is basically just ensure that you're not doing a broad literature review of the topic that you're reviewing, because the body of the review is what should be doing that. Your introduction should tell your reader why this review was necessary and what you're doing. What is the specific aim of your review? So the function of the introduction, even in the review article, is the same, right? Because the method and result, whether you're doing a narrative review or a systematic review or a meta-analysis, the function of that study is the same. It's to synthesize a large amount of information for the reader in one of these three forms. So the introduction should ensure that the reader understands why you're doing it. It's not an introduction to the topic, it's an introduction to the review. I hope that makes sense. The body of the review, the structure is going to vary depending on what material you're actually reviewing. So in that, in the body of the review, you can take advantage of the ways in which readers expect information to be presented. So you can begin with an overview, you can have subheadings, and if you mention your subheadings in your overview, then the reader already knows what structure to expect in the main body. So if you say you have 5 subheadings, then when you, after your introduction, you give a general overview of the review, and then you mention those 5 subheadings, then the reader knows, okay, I know what trajectory you're going to follow with this review article. So then he sees the 5 subheadings, then he understands why they are present and why they are present in that order. Then after you've presented the main body of your review, you again stop and you give a summary of exactly what it is that you've done. So this is the normal structure for an argument, which is I state my thesis statement or my argument statement. I explain my argument, and then I end with a summary of that same argument. So you can take advantage of these expectations of structure for the reader, but it's not as prescribed or as black and white as it is for research articles where the IMRaD format is generally expected. A lot of people are asking about how many authors. Honestly, the number of authors is the number of people that are needed to do the work. That could be one person, it could be 5 people, it could be 50 people. What you need to ensure that you do is that all your authors actually should be listed as authors of the manuscript. So they all should have contributed significantly to the work that is being presented. So if they have not done that, if say you had a discussion with somebody several times about say, oh, maybe I was thinking about doing it like this, and then they say, oh, why don't you do this? And then you say, oh, thank you, and you do it. Now that's obviously not sufficient to call somebody the author of the manuscript. You can add that person to the acknowledgements and thank them for the insight, but because they didn't contribute significantly to the work, you wouldn't call them an author. So there isn't only a minimum or maximum number of authors, it's the number of people that were essential to doing the work. So somebody is asking about a questionnaire-based study. They said it's a narrative review, won't be accepted. Again, now this is important when we talked about choosing the right audience for your study right at the beginning of this session. That's where this becomes important. If you're doing a specific type of study, then you need to submit it to a journal whose readers find that type of study important. So for example, if you write a narrative review and you submit it to a journal which is specifically focused on either clinical studies or on systematic reviews, then obviously they know that their readers are not going to be interested in such a study. They are not going to look at it. They're going to say, maybe this is the wrong journal for you. So your initial choice of journal is something that you should think about. What is the audience of that journal? You might not get it right every time, and that's unfortunate because that can kind of waste your time, because you send it to the journal, they sit on it for a month, and then they come back and tell you, oh, this is the wrong journal for this study. So you want to maybe study the audience of the journal that you're planning to submit to before you actually make that initial submission. Most journals will have very specific information listed in their aims and scope section about what types of studies they accept and don't accept. If they don't, then sometimes that's something you find out only once you submit. That can't be helped. But largely, you should be able to judge this based on what types of studies are published in that journal. So even just reviewing what studies the journal publishes might help. Not just in terms of what field they publish in, but what types of studies they accept. So I won't address the plagiarism issue because Sunena is going to go into it in considerable detail. So somebody asked about how to begin writing review articles. Now, like I said, the reason I said that the aim statement is so important is that the aim statement is going to inform you as to how to write your review. You need to be very clear in your mind about why this review is necessary, because without that, you cannot write an introduction because you can't explain to the reader why the review is necessary. Once you know why the review is necessary, then to say, okay, how do I identify articles and how do I present those findings in a way that serves the aim of my study. So the aim of your study should be your beginning point for everything. Okay, some of the other questions are less specific, so I'll get into them later. Okay. Because of the nature of whom we're talking about today, I just also wanted to get into checklists and reporting guidelines. Now, if you're reporting any kind of clinical research, then it becomes very important to adhere to certain norms and restrictions when reporting your study. This is partly because you want the study to be as informative and as useful as possible. And also because in order to be able to judge the merit of a study, your readers need to be certain that you have conformed to certain expectations. So that is basically what these reporting guidelines do. Now, depending on what type of study you are publishing, you will need to conform to different reporting guidelines. And there are many, as you can see. Now, so for example, for randomized trials, there is what is called the consort guidelines. Now, all of these are abbreviations. So for observation studies, you have STROBE. For systematic reviews, you have PRISMA. For study protocols, you have SPIRIT. Diagnostic studies, you have START. For case reports, you have CARE. For clinical practice guidelines, there's AGREE. SRQR for qualitative research. ARRIVE for animal preclinical studies. Squire for quality improvement, and Cheers for economic evaluations. Now, how to actually determine which type of reporting guideline you need to follow is, I'll get into this next slide. I just want to show you the consort reporting checklist in particular, just to show you how detailed these checklists can be. So it actually has very prescribed things for what should be present in the title and the abstract. So for example, here they say you need to identify it as a randomized trial in the title. You need to have a structured summary of the design, methods, results, and conclusions. Then they have specific guidelines on how to write the introduction. They have specific guidelines on what all information should be in the method. So the trial design, the participants, the interventions that were used, the outcomes, the sample size, how you randomized your study population, how you blinded your study population. Then what statistical methods that you use. So if your study does not have all of this information, the journal will say that you have not conformed to the consort guidelines. Consort is Consolidated Standards for Reporting Trials. So if you, the good thing about these reporting guidelines is if you conform to them from the beginning, that you know that most of your important information is already going to be there. So then your results. So again, what is your participant flow? What were your outcomes? What were the harms, or what were the adverse events? Then you have your discussion, you have your limitations, your generalizability, that is how much your specific findings can be applied to more generalizable populations, or whether they can and how much they can. The interpretation of your findings, and other information, which is registration. Most clinical trials need to be registered before they can be begun. I just wanted to mention that. And yeah, so now let's talk about how to decide which guidelines are relevant to your work. As you can see, it's not a simple decision. It's a pretty complicated decision. This flowchart I took from the website for the Equator Network, which is a consortium of people, international consortium, which is looking to improve the overall reporting quality of clinical research. So it's, I'll share the URL. It's quite a useful website. I'll just check back in with the, okay, so about case studies or case reports, like I said, your introduction, they usually will be brief. Most journals will have some kind of word limit on case studies and case reports. So you want to conform to those word limits, which means that your introduction and your discussion need to be very focused. So that would be my primary advice for writing case studies and case reports. Your introduction should only give you that much information that you need to understand why this case report is interesting or why it's relevant. And your discussion should only discuss the specific important things that you observed and the reason why you're reporting that case report. Yes, you do need to mention in your methodology that you have conformed to certain reporting guidelines. Who develops these guidelines? There's multiple people. It's not one single authority, but these have emerged out of years of research and discussion about this. I'm just scrolling up to see if I can find any other specific questions. Somebody asked whether the number of co-authors has a negative effect on the impact of the first author. It depends. Generally, people feel that if you have, say, 50 different co-authors, then you need to have a very specific reason for having so many co-authors. But like I said, what you want to think about is whether each author contributed substantially to the manuscript. So what many journals will ask you for is to give a statement of authorship. So they will say, you know, A person and B person wrote the manuscript, C person designed the study, D person collected the data. So if you have a section where you're actually required to explain what each author did, that can help to clarify why each of those people was designated as an author. Okay, moving on. So somebody asked what order the paper should be written in, and I don't know whether you read my mind. That was my next slide. So I would suggest that you start with writing the methods and results, because the methods is what you did. You have the most clear idea of what you did and what you found. Then your discussion should come next, because this is where you actually explain what these findings mean. Then you can write your introduction, because your introduction is largely information that you were already aware of before you started writing the study. Then you write your abstract, because that's once you've written the main text of the papers, when you know what the abstract actually needs to represent. And last, you write your title. And like I said, your title should be written not only with reference to what your study is about, but with reference to what your audience is going to be. So you can have a different title depending on which journal you're submitting to or whom you expect to read your paper. Okay, we'll quickly talk about tense because it is something that comes up in scientific writing. Now, generally, established facts are written in the present tense and reported findings are written in the past tense. So because of this, the conventions for tense usage in various sections of the manuscript differs. The introduction is largely written in present tense because this is usually largely established fact. Methods and results are reporting something that you did in the past, so usually written in the past tense. The discussion is usually written in the present tense because it's, again, you're reporting the results of previous studies, which conventionally you take them to be established fact because they have gone through peer review and they are generally considered to be facts. And you use past tense judiciously to contrast your findings with those of previous studies. Okay, so for example, the incidence of many infections is seasonal. This is an established fact. Recent studies reveal strong evidence. Now, because these recent studies were conducted in the past, you use the past tense here. Blah, 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 risk of surgical site infections is highly seasonal, again, because it's an established fact. Most studies did not distinguish because you're talking about some specific studies in the past and you're contrasting that with what you are going to do. Okay, now the methods. This study was conducted from July to August because it's done in the past. The Akimoto Hospital is located in Accra because it is still located in Accra. The locations of the study area are indicated in figure 1. Now, this is because you are explaining what you're presenting in a figure. So the figure is in the present tense. So your figure citation is also conventionally in the present tense. Results and discussion. We performed exams because they were done in the past. The patient age was so-and-so because these results are being reported from the past. But tumors were found in the sample, again, because it's in the past. But when you're saying table 2 shows the distribution, you can't say table 2 showed, because table 2 is in your manuscript right now. It still shows the distribution of cases. So that is in the present tense. Okay. Then in the discussion, CVCs continue to play present tense. The USRDS reports that so-and-so because it still does. But here you're talking about one specific past study. So you say 15% of the patients were still dialyzed because in that particular study. Okay, before we get to the quiz. So somebody asked whether the reporting guidelines are different for different specialities. Usually not, because the type of study that you're conducting is usually not dependent on the specialty. But some reporting guidelines might be more relevant to some fields than to others. So for reviews, you're talking about tense usage in reviews. Usually they will be in present tense because you're talking about established facts. But if you want to contrast two studies one against the other, then those two you will usually say in the past tense. You'll say, for example, Smith et al. Reported that blah, 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 blah. But Jones et al. Reported that something else. But on the other hand, if you want to say, we know that this has been reported in multiple trials, then this is in the present tense. So it depends on whether you're talking generally or you're talking about specific studies. You can mention where the study was conducted in the method section if that is relevant. Say, for example, if you're talking about a cohort or a case series, then it's important for you to explain where that cohort was. So then you might want to explicitly state where the study was conducted. Okay. Is there anything else that I can answer right away? Okay, somebody asked about the appropriate numbers of figures and tables in a study. This depends on what kind of data you're presenting. If your data is largely quantitative and it will be very difficult for you to present all of these numbers in text in the results, then you obviously will have a lot of figures and tables. Obviously, you don't want any unnecessary figures and tables. Say, for example, if you say 53% of the study population was male, This is obviously not something that you need to represent in a figure or a table. You can say that one line and then you're done. So in a similar way, you need to weigh whether every figure or table in your study is essential. And if it is essential, then it has to be there. Some journals have limitations on how many figures and tables you can provide for a particular study, in which case you might need to move some figures and tables to what is called a supplementary material, in which case it's not part of the main manuscript, but it is supplementary data to help you understand the findings. But again, like I said, I would say there's no prescribed number of figures or tables. It's whether it's necessary or not. What else? Somebody asked about the appropriate length of a manuscript. It depends on the journal. Some journals have word count limitations on manuscript length, some don't. But I personally believe that I look at every sentence of a manuscript and say, is this necessary? Is this necessary? Is this necessary? Somebody asked about the correct way to write tables. This depends entirely on the journal. Journals will say use uppercase T, use lowercase t, write figure, write fig. All of these things are specific to the journal. So this is something that you need to check once you decide which manuscript to submit to. So I'm going to move on because some of these questions are a little more general. I'd like to get to them at the end. Okay. So short quiz. Which of the following sections is not covered in the acronym IMRaD? Introduction, methods, results, abstract, or discussion? Yeah, I think overwhelmingly people are saying abstract, and yes, it is the abstract. The acronym IMRaD only covers the main text. The abstract is usually not included in the main text of the document. Okay, next question. When referring to established facts, use the past tense, true or false? Right, so there's a little bit of a mix of answers. When you're referring to an established fact, say for example, and I'll give you an example of an established fact, the sun rises in the east. Now, once I say that, it's obvious to you that I can't say the sun rose in the east unless I'm saying the sun rose in the east yesterday. But when I'm trying to explain to somebody where the sun rises from, I'll say the sun rises in the east, so I can't use the past tense for that. So false. You would not use past tense for established fact. Which of the following points is invalid for the discussion? The discussion must restate all the results. The discussion must mention the limitations of the study. The discussion must discuss the findings of the present study in the context of those of previous studies, which is not valid. Right, so I think everyone is in agreement on this. The answer is A, the discussion should not restate all the results. The discussion should only state the results to the extent that it's necessary to understand the interpretation of them that you're providing. When referring to figures and tables in the manuscript, always use the present tense. So to give you an example, patient characteristics are presented in table 1, or patient characteristics were presented in table 1. Which one is correct? Yeah, you're right. You definitely always use the present tense when you're referring to figures and tables in the manuscript. Next. Which of the following points is valid for the abstract? It should be at least 200 words. It should always be structured, or it should be considered a standalone section and must be understood independent of the main text. Right. Okay. So largely, I think people are saying that the answer is C. It should be considered a standalone section. And yes, that's right. There's no rule saying that the abstract has to be so many words long for it to be effective. I have seen very effective 100-word abstracts, 50-word abstracts. The abstract need not necessarily be explicitly structured into subheadings. The information in those subheadings should be present in the right format, but it's not necessary that it should have the word background, methods, results, and conclusion. It's not essential. It depends on the journal. Okay, next. Methods must be written in sufficient detail to allow other researchers to reproduce them. True or false? Yeah, I think obviously you definitely want to ensure that the methods are sufficiently detailed that other researchers can reproduce your findings. Right. Which of the following points is invalid for the results? The results should only state the results and not include detail or discussion. The results has to be the longest section of the manuscript. And even negative results must contribute to research. Which one is invalid? That's right. The results need not necessarily be the longest section of the manuscript. I'm sorry, this box has shifted. The correct answer is B. The correct answer is B. Sorry, I'm not sure why that happened. Okay. Next, figures are more effective than tables for the presentation of data. True or false? Yeah, somebody said it depends, and I think that's really the best answer. It depends on what kind of data you're presenting. So that's not always necessarily true. Okay, that's the last of our quiz questions. So we'll talk quickly about references and citations. There are multiple ways to present references and citations. You can either have author date citations, which is like Smith 1999. That's an author date citation. In such cases, you have alphabetically arranged reference lists. You can have numbered citations, that is, the sun rises in the east, in brackets 1, and chronologically arranged references. Chronologically means in the order that they're cited in the text. And there is a mixed format where you have numbered citations, but the references are alphabetically arranged and they have numbers. In such a case, for example, okay, I'll talk about the two main formats first. I think that may be easier. Okay. So numbered, or what is often called Vancouver citations, are like this. You have the number 1 and no author or date. And that number corresponds to the number of that reference in the reference list. So for example, here's citation number 5 corresponding to reference number 5. Here's citation number 7 corresponding to reference number 7. The next type of citation is the author date citation. So for example, you have, here's your citation, Bakema et al. 2015, which corresponds to that particular citation in the reference list, which is then ordered alphabetically going from A to Z. Now, in the mixed format that I told you about, the citations will look like this, but the numbers in the reference list will not be, number 1 will not be the first citation, it will be citation A. And then, so for example, the first citation cited in the main text will not be citation number 1, it will be citation number 28. But this is a fairly rarely used format for references. There is no question of which citation is more appropriate than another. It depends entirely on what the journal wants. Okay, somebody said, what is why the methods of naming authors different among entomologists, nematologists, and botanists? That is simply because the nomenclature for plant and animal species differs. There is no good reason. The citation style is completely dependent on the journal. Yes. Somebody asked about the number of words in an abstract. Yes, many journals do have word limits on the abstract, and that's again completely specific to the journal. If the journal says abstract has to be 200 words, you have to somehow make your abstract within 200 words. Somebody says, why can't we have a universal citation style? And I think whenever we talk about references and citations, everybody asks this. There is no good answer. It's just the journals have sort of evolved these different citation styles. It makes everybody's life difficult, and I don't personally think that we gain anything by having different citation styles. But somebody asked whether the number of citations has an impact on manuscript quality. Most journals will discourage you from using unnecessary citations. So again, use only as many as you need to make your point. Somebody says, what about cross-references? Most journals will discourage the use of cross-references. You largely want to cite the study that you are referring to and not a study that refers to the study that you're referring to. If people who don't know what a cross-reference is, it's basically say, if I want to cite a result from study A, but I don't have access to the paper of study A, I have access to the paper of study B. So I will cite paper B, which cites paper A. So that's what a cross-reference is. So I won't talk about paraphrasing or plagiarism because Sunena will talk about that. Somebody says, should we avoid very old citations? Yes, ideally you want to use the most recent studies. That said, if the citation that you need is a study that was published in 1934, then it was a study that was published in 1934, as long as there's been no subsequent work on it since then. Okay. So now that we've talked about references, somebody asked about reference management software. If you don't know what that is, I had this little thing about the life of a researcher. Obviously, one of the things that you have to do to write that takes up your time is writing papers. You have to actually do the work that you're writing papers on. You need to do your statistical analysis. You have either field work or clinical work that you do in the meantime. Many researchers also have teaching responsibilities. So what you don't want is for the writing and formatting of your paper to take up a bunch of your time. So to avoid that, they have what is called reference management software. There is no specific recommendation for one over the other. Some of these are free. Mendeley and Zotero are free, and Note is not free. But none of them is put one worse or better than the other. Some of them are more user-friendly than others. It depends on what you're comfortable with using. Software for data analysis, there are various statistical suites. There's R is one that is used, SPSS is one that is used. You can even use Excel. Excel does have some data analysis capabilities. And yeah, so I think that's the end of my presentation. I have answered, I think, quite a few of these questions, but I think we have time for a few more.
Thank you, Malti. A brilliant session and some brilliant examples. I think the examples would have been very, very helpful for all our participants today to follow your talk and the tips that you were giving them to develop their scientific writing skills. Thank you for also taking all those questions during the session, the very specific questions that you could manage to take during the session. What we can do, we have like 4 minutes with us before we break for a screen break. So we can take some very general questions. I would like to start with the most general question of the session. I think, how do we improve our scientific writing skills? What is the formula to do that, when, particularly when you are not a native English speaker?
So I think the first thing is you need to understand, like I said, what is the function of scientific writing. So once you've understood that, there is actually a lot of resources online that can help you. If you have, say, more specific issues with like ensuring grammatically correct sentences and things like that, there are plugins like Grammarly which you can use to help you. Or you can actually just have, say, somebody, if you feel that there's somebody in your lab or some collaborator of yours who would be able to help you with the language, and that person can go over the manuscript once you've finished it. Or there's professional services that you can employ, like Editage, that will help you to improve the presentation of your manuscript. More generally, to write better presented manuscripts, there is again a lot of resources online. I personally there's this one article series in a journal called Clinical Chemistry on how to write scientific manuscripts, which is actually excellent, and I'll share that as a resource with this group. There are, again, various other places like Editage themselves. We have a platform called Editage Insights, where there's a lot of resources on how to write articles, how to write grants, how to ensure that you don't get comments for language when you submit to a journal, how to write better introductions, how to write better literature reviews. So there's a lot of resources online available. But I think the best thing that you can do is to read well-written manuscripts. That's how you internalize what looks good, what works, what makes manuscripts readable, what makes manuscripts comprehensible. So in the reading that you would generally do as part of your research or life anyway, I think if you include that perspective in your reading, that helps a lot.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for just one more question. Again, this has been a debate among scientific writers. How often can we use active voice in scientific writing? Can we write the whole paper in active voice?
So largely, journals used to say, use passive voice because passive voice is more formal. Like I said, it places more emphasis on what was done rather than the person who was doing it. But largely now the scientific community is moving away from that for the reasons that I said. active voice sentences are simply easier to read. They're simpler sentences. So unless your journal specifically says we want you to write in passive voice, I don't think there's anything stopping you from writing the entire paper in active voice if you want to. I think it would make the paper a lot more readable.
Okay, thank you so much, Malti, for that brilliant session again. And thank you for taking up our questions. We will again have you back in the question answer session after the session, second session with Sunaina. So you everybody can, if you have more questions, just type them out in the chat box. We will take a 5-minute screen break. Go grab your snack or your glass of water, and see you back at 11:30 sharp.
Thank you.